preaching series, The Bible We Don't Want to Hear, I have picked two of my favorite passages. One from the Hebrew Bible and one from the New Testament. And I cannot tell you how many times I've quoted from Matthew 31:46 in papers, sermons, and discussions, and Micah. Don't you just love Micah? In one verse, that prophet has told us how to live in 3 actionable steps. Do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. I really do love these biblical passages, except for the fact that I have omitted from my mind a most important detail: the element of judgment that undergirds both Micah and Matthew. I overlook judgment, God's judgment to be precise, because I don't like it. I do what I so often do. I edit and forget it. So, God's judgment is precisely what I'm going to talk about. And I think judgment fits very nicely into our theme of the Bible we don't want to hear. When I read this Micah passage, I immediately focus on do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. I totally overlook the word requirement. And what does the Lord require of you? When a requirement is involved, it means accountability. I will be judged on how I meet this requirement. I will be held accountable. Doing justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly with God is not an option. It is a requirement. And I chafe at requirements and the judgment that goes with them, especially in the Bible, where I'd rather hear about God's unconditional love, unending forgiveness, and unasked for grace. When I think of those times that I have been judged and criticized, I remember certain instances when I have felt ashamed and angry. Now, I will tell a story from my life in a moment which relates directly to this. So the upshot is that I mentally edit out the word requirement. I edit and forget it. But what is God's judgment? To answer this, let's turn to the Matthew passage. Like a triple-decker sandwich, judgment is inserted 3 times in the text. In fact, this verse is known as the last part of a large discourse on judgment in Matthew. So judgment seems pretty hard to ignore, you'd think. But, as I have on many occasions, I seem to have a talent to edit and forget it. The first example is the separation of the sheep from the goats. And I want to stop right here and say I don't like either animal too much. Sheep are too docile, and goats eat anything. And you might have read that the Congressional Cemetery has hired a bunch of goats to eat all the poison ivy that's taking over. The mere concept makes my throat itch just thinking of those animals. But the story, luckily, really isn't about sheep and goats. In fact, the Hebrew word is the same for both. It's about separation. And that is what I believe God's judgment is all about. It is about accountability and responsibility to live the life we are called to live as Christians. The failure to do so leads to separation. Each example in the text is about being separated from each other and from God. The kingdom of God is inseparable from our relationships with people. We can choose to live the life of justice and compassion, as is so simply and eloquently stated in Micah, or lead a life of indifference. Indifference, the opposite of compassion. We will be held accountable. Will we be made whole, or will we remain fragmented? It's up to us. God's judgment is about accountability and responsibility. This can be painful when we fall short, which is why I edit and forget it. I'll digress right here. I just want to take time out for a minute to say that both the Micah passage and the Hebrew passage, both the Micah from the Hebrew passage and the Matthew from the New Testament work equally well for us as Christians. Why? Because the teachings of the New Testament are basically, the ethical teachings from the New Testament are basically from the Jewish religion of the Hebrew Bible. Both Jesus and that somewhat make it up as you go along systematic theologian Paul of Tarsus, St. Paul, are both Jewish. Like it or not, judgment is a real presence in Jesus' teaching. He did, after all, consider himself a prophet. Craig Hill, my New Testament professor at Wesley Theological Seminary, writes, Jesus believed in the mercy of God and in future judgment. This affirmation compels us to take seriously dimensions of Jesus' teaching that we might prefer to overlook. The Jesus of the Gospels is not so comfortable a figure as we might imagine or like him to be. As I mentioned earlier, I want to end with a story from my own life. A micro illustration, if you will. But the Matthew passage has macro dimensions. And in fact, the chapter heading in the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, that's the section 31 to 46, is called Judgment of All Nations. When we read the Matthew text, we cannot help but feel the large issues that surround us today. Emigration, healthcare, world hunger, you name it. The passage really calls for a corporate response. It is a call to action by all of us who have compassion for others in need. And guess what? We earn no gold stars for doing this. Righteous behavior we are to live by is done not for the sake of reward. Our attention to the needy, the sick, and the hungry, and the incarcerated is not a charitable handout. This is not a tax-deductible gift. What is absolutely remarkable about this passage of Matthew is that both the righteous and the unrighteous have absolutely no idea that they did or did not serve that King incarnated in the needy. Robert Kaiser, a professor of preaching and the New Testament at the Candler School of Theology, writes, "The righteous are righteous for what they did without reward or goodness, but only because they encounter the least." In other words, righteous behavior is done for the simple reason that others are in need, without thought of what is right or wrong, and what is rewarding and what is not. We are held to be accountable as Christians to lead the life we're supposed to be leading all along. Will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being is asked of us at our baptism. When we edit and forget it, that call to action becomes hollow words. We can drift into indifference. A life of living justice and compassion, that is the Christian life that's the Christian life as I see it. We get no gold stars for doing what we're supposed to be doing all along. We do not dance in the end zone for scoring a touchdown, because that is precisely what we're paid the gazillion bucks for. No, our gold stars will not get us into heaven. I find it difficult to get my head around macro issues without first examining the micro events in my life. So my personal story is a micro story. This story centers around the line from the text, "And when was it we saw you sick and visited you?" It captures the theme of separation, shame, and then shalom, wholeness, and peace. It is not about gold stars. It is about those ordinary moments that offers opportunities to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with our God. I consider it a miracle story. For many years, I ignored my first wife, Kathleen, the mother of my daughter, Sarah. Her presence in my mind reminded me that I had failed at my first marriage, which also meant, in a way, failure as a father. I have a natural tendency to want to be perceived as a successful presence to others. Just dealing with Kathleen and matters that involve Sarah brought on feelings of shame and anger. When in the 1990s, Kathleen's melanoma, discovered during Sarah's birth in 1970, spread to her brain, I still kept my distance. I treated her not with compassion, but with that opposite, indifference. This made me inwardly more ashamed and angry at my inability to do what I knew I ought to do. I felt separated from my true self. As a result, I know I hurt Kathleen's feelings. I made Sarah feel anxious and upset, and I confounded Stephanie, whose compassion is a deeply flowing river. One day, Sarah called to say that her mom was in the hospital and appeared to be fading. Stephanie immediately said to me that we, meaning especially me, have to go visit Kathleen in the hospital. I balked. The distance between who I am and who I could be had become impossibly wide. Then, amazingly, on the same day, the Reverend Will Billow, friend of both Kathleen and Sarah and Stephanie and me, called to say that Kathleen is dying and that if we were going to go visit her, now is the time. I knew Will and always thought of him as a priest in the mind of God. I heard him. So Stephanie and I drove to George Washington Hospital. Both of us were nervous. We arrived outside Kathleen's room. I did not want to go any further. My whole pitiful behavior toward Kathleen welled up within me. I was never more ashamed, but there was no going back. I went in. Kathleen, surrounded by the tubes and wires, the beeps and sighs, all the contraptions of modern hospital care. Kathleen raised her head off the pillow, looked at me, and said with a big smile, "Oh, David, how good it is to see you." Shalom. Amen.
Amen.